Have you ever made a choice in a split second that changed everything you thought you knew about right and wrong? In the summer of 1878, a ranch hand named Thomas Caldwell faced exactly that moment. What he did, as the sun painted the Arizona sky blood red, would cost him everything he had, everyone he loved, and force an entire town to confront a truth they'd spent decades refusing to see. This is the story of one sunset, one decision, and the price of seeing another human being when everyone else saw only an enemy. The heat of late August hung over the trail between Prescott and the Verde Valley, like a wool blanket soaked in kerosene. Thomas Caldwell rode his dun mare along the rocky path, the animal's hooves clicking against the stones with a rhythm that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. At 32 years old, Thomas had spent half his life in Arizona Territory, working cattle for the McAllister Ranch, a spread that ran nearly 5,000 head across land that had once belonged to the Yavapai and Tonto Apache. He was a quiet man, known for his steady hand with livestock and his ability to read weather in the way clouds gathered over the Bradshaw Mountains. People in Prescott trusted him the way they trusted sunrise, expected and unremarkable. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the juniper-dotted landscape, when Thomas spotted the figures ahead. 3 of them, huddled near an outcropping of red rock where a thin trickle of water seeped from a crack in the stone. Even from a distance, he could see they were Apache. 2 women and a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. One of the women was heavily pregnant, her body curved around the weight of the life inside her. They were gathering water in clay vessels, their movements slow and careful, like people who knew that any sudden motion could mean death. Thomas reined in his mare about 50 yards out. His hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard, not drawing it but resting there, ready. Every rancher, every settler, every soul who'd made Arizona Territory their home knew the stories, the raids, the ambushes, the bodies found with arrows still quivering in them. Just 3 months earlier, a family named Henderson had been killed 15 miles south of here, their cabin burned, their livestock scattered. The territorial governor had declared open season on hostile Apache bands. The reward for scalps had drawn bounty hunters from as far as Texas and California. But these 3 didn't look hostile. They looked exhausted, desperate. The pregnant woman's face was drawn with pain, and the child clung to the other woman's skirt with the wide-eyed fear of someone who'd seen too much death for such young eyes. Thomas sat his horse, watching them watch him, and felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't quite name, but that felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story of impossible choices in the Old West, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We bring you these untold histories every week, stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the frontier. And drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love knowing our community spans the globe, united by a fascination with the truth behind the legends. The decision came to Thomas not as a thought, but as an action. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, away from his weapons. He reached for his canteen, the good one made of tin that kept water cool even in the brutal afternoon heat, and walked forward with measured steps. The women tensed, ready to run, but they were too weak, too far gone to flee with any real speed. The pregnant one looked like she might collapse at any moment. Thomas stopped 10 feet away and set the canteen on a flat rock, then stepped back with his hands raised, palms out. He spoke no Apache and assumed they spoke no English, but some communications transcended language. Water, life. A choice not to kill when killing would have been easier, safer, more accepted by every person he knew. The older woman, her face weathered by sun and hardship until it looked like carved mesquite wood, studied him with eyes that held equal measures of suspicion and calculation. She was making her own choice, weighing her own risks. After a long moment that stretched like taffy under the lowering sun, she stepped forward and took the canteen. She didn't drink first but gave it to the child, who drank in great gulping swallows, water spilling down the front of a cotton shirt that had seen better days. Then the pregnant woman drank, her hands shaking as she raised the canteen to her lips. Thomas watched them and felt his world tilting on an axis he hadn't known existed. These were supposed to be savages, the enemy, the threat that justified every brutal act committed in the name of civilization. But what he saw were 3 human beings dying of thirst, no different from any settler family he might encounter in distress along the trail. The realization didn't come with trumpets or revelation. It came quiet, like a door closing on everything he'd believed about the territory and his place in it. When the pregnant woman suddenly gasped and grabbed her belly, Thomas knew he'd crossed a line he could never step back across. Her water had broken. The child was coming, here in the fading light, with no shelter and no help except what he could provide. The older woman looked at him with an expression that pleaded and challenged at the same time, as if to say, "You've started this act of mercy. Now see it through or admit you're the savage they say we are." Thomas had helped birth calves, had pulled breechfolds from mares in the darkness of McAllister's barn, but he'd never delivered a human child. Yet as the pregnant woman sank to her knees with a cry that seemed to tear the air itself, he found himself moving without conscious thought. He stripped off his vest and laid it on the ground as a cushion. He built a small fire using dry juniper branches, not for warmth in the still hot evening, but for light and for something that felt like civilization, like the idea that birth should happen in firelight, not in gathering darkness. The older woman took charge with the calm efficiency of someone who'd brought many children into the world. Thomas followed her gestures, bringing water, tearing strips from his spare shirt to use as cloths, holding the laboring woman's hand as she squeezed hard enough to leave marks that would last for days. The child, the young one who'd drunk from his canteen, sat at the edge of the firelight and watched with solemn eyes that had already seen more than most children should witness in a lifetime. The birth took hours. The sun set and the stars emerged, brilliant and indifferent in the vast Arizona sky. Thomas had left the trail for this clearing, had committed himself to this moment with no thought of what it would cost. The pregnant woman screamed and pushed, her body doing the ancient work of bringing life into a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. And when the baby finally emerged, slick and red and wailing with the outrage of the newly born, Thomas felt tears on his own face, unexpected and unstoppable. It was a girl. The older woman cleaned the infant with practiced hands, wrapped her in the last of Thomas's torn shirt, and placed her in her mother's arms. The new mother looked down at her daughter with an expression of such pure love that Thomas had to look away, feeling like he was intruding on something sacred. In that moment, he understood that whatever happened next, whatever price he paid for this night, it would be worth it to have witnessed this, to have helped, to have chosen life over the easy cruelty that the frontier demanded. But the frontier doesn't forgive mercy, especially not mercy shown to those it has marked for extinction. Thomas didn't hear the riders until they were almost upon them. 6 men from Prescott, including Samuel Greaves, who owned the dry goods store, and his son Robert, barely 20, but already hard in the way young men become when they're given license to hate. They'd been tracking the Apache women since morning, following the trail of 2 people moving slowly, burdened by pregnancy and a child. They'd expected to find them weak and vulnerable, easy targets for the bounty that awaited them in town. What they found instead was Thomas Caldwell, respected ranch hand, kneeling beside a fire with 3 Apache women and a newborn infant, looking for all the world like he belonged there. "What in the hell are you doing, Caldwell?" Samuel Greaves demanded, his rifle already aimed at the older Apache woman. The other men fanned out, surrounding the small camp, cutting off any escape. Robert Greaves had a wild look in his eyes, the expression of someone eager to prove something to himself and the world. Thomas stood slowly, moving between the riders and the women. "There's a woman here who just gave birth," he said, keeping his voice level. "She needs rest. They all need rest. They're no threat to anyone." "No threat?" Samuel laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "They're Apache, Caldwell. They're the enemy. You know what they did to the Henderson family." You know what they've done to dozens of good Christian folks trying to make a life in this territory. These women didn't do anything to anybody, Thomas replied. Look at them. Look at that baby. What threat are they? Every Apache is a threat, Robert said, his voice high and tight. Every one of them that lives is one more that'll grow up to kill our people. My father's right. You've lost your mind, Caldwell, sitting here like some kind of Apache lover. The slur hung in the air like gun smoke. Thomas felt the weight of it, knew that in the eyes of these men, and soon in the eyes of everyone in Prescott, he would be marked by it. Apache lover, traitor, worse than the enemy, because he'd chosen them over his own kind. I'm taking them back to Prescott, Samuel declared. They'll stand trial for being on settled land without permission. And if we find out they're connected to any of the raids, they'll hang. She just gave birth an hour ago, Thomas said, his voice harder now. She can't ride. She can't even walk. You take her now, you'll kill her, and that baby both. Then maybe that's God's will, Robert said, moving his horse forward, his rifle trained on the mother and child. Thomas didn't think. His hand moved to his pistol, drawing it in one smooth motion and pointing it at Robert Greaves. You'll have to go through me first. The silence that followed was absolute. 6 guns against 1. Mathematics that any fool could calculate. But Thomas didn't lower his weapon, and something in his eyes must have conveyed that he would fire, that he would kill Robert Greaves if the young man moved 1 inch closer to that mother and her newborn daughter. Samuel Greaves saw it too. You're making a mistake, Caldwell. A mistake that'll cost you everything. Lower that gun and step aside, and we'll say you were confused, that you didn't understand what you were doing. But if you pull that trigger, if you side with them over your own people, there's no coming back from that. You'll be an outlaw, hunted same as any Apache raider. Thomas's hand didn't waver. Then I guess I'm an outlaw, because I'm not letting you touch these women, not tonight, not while I'm breathing. The standoff stretched. 1 minute, 2. The fire crackled, and the newborn made small mewling sounds against her mother's chest. The older Apache woman watched Thomas with an expression that might have been wonder, or might have been pity, understanding perhaps better than he did what his choice would cost. Finally, Samuel Greaves lowered his rifle. We'll remember this, Caldwell. Every person in Prescott will know what you did here, what you chose. And when those women grow strong enough to run, when they disappear back into the mountains with their people, when the next raid comes and good folks die, that blood will be on your hands. You hear me? That blood is on you. The riders turned and left, but Thomas knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. He'd crossed a line that the frontier drew in blood and fury, and there was no crossing back. For 3 days, Thomas stayed with the Apache women in that clearing. He hunted rabbit and quail to feed them. He kept the fire burning through the cold desert nights. He watched as the mother grew stronger, as colour returned to her face, as she nursed her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of all new mothers. The older woman, whose name he learned was Nailin, which meant maiden in her language, taught him words in Apache. Mother, child, water, thank you. The simple vocabulary of survival and gratitude. The young child, a boy named Casa, meaning robe or fur, slowly lost some of his fear of Thomas. By the second day, he would sit near the white man, watching him clean his rifle or repair his saddle with the focused curiosity of childhood. Thomas showed him how to tie knots, the same ones his own father had taught him in Missouri before the war, before everything had gone to hell and scattered families across the continent in search of new starts. On the morning of the 4th day, the women prepared to leave. The mother, whose name was Chodini, she is dancing, could walk now, though slowly, her newborn daughter wrapped against her chest in a cradle made from yucca fibre that Nalin had woven. They had no words to give Thomas that would encompass what he'd done for them. But Nalin placed her hand over his heart and spoke in Apache, words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. You are good. You are brave. We will remember." Thomas watched them walk into the mountains, 3 women and 2 children, heading toward whatever remained of their people in the high country where the cavalry couldn't easily follow. He knew he should feel afraid of what awaited him in Prescott, but what he felt instead was a strange peace, as if he'd finally done something in his life that mattered beyond counting cattle or mending fence. The reckoning came faster than he expected. When Thomas rode into Prescott 2 days later, the town had already judged and convicted him. The streets were lined with people who'd known him for years, who'd shared drinks with him at the Palace Saloon, who'd trusted him to deliver their cattle to market in Flagstaff. Now they looked at him like he was something diseased, something dangerous that needed to be eliminated. Samuel Greaves stood on the steps of the territorial courthouse with a dozen men behind him, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of men who believed they were doing righteous work. "Thomas Caldwell," Samuel announced, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "You're under arrest for aiding and abetting the enemy, for interfering with the lawful execution of territorial policy regarding hostile Indians, and for threatening the life of a citizen. You'll stand trial tomorrow morning." Thomas dismounted slowly. He could have run, could have turned his mare and raced for the border, for Mexico, for anywhere but here. But some part of him needed to see this through, needed to stand up and say that what he'd done was right, even if the whole world called it wrong. They locked him in the jail behind the courthouse, a small adobe building that baked in the sun and turned into an oven by midday. Through the barred window, Thomas could hear the town discussing his fate. Some called for hanging. Others wanted him banished, sent out into the desert with no horse, no water, left to die the way they believed he'd condemned the town to death by helping the enemy. The trial was short and brutal. The judge was a circuit rider named Harlan Blackwood, a man who'd made his reputation hanging horse thieves and claim jumpers with equal enthusiasm. He listened to Samuel Greaves describe finding Thomas consorting with hostile Apache. He heard Robert Greaves testify that Thomas had drawn a weapon on a white man to protect savages. He nodded along as witness after witness described Thomas's betrayal of everything decent folks held sacred. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he stood and faced the packed courtroom. Every person he'd ever known in Arizona Territory was there, watching him with eyes that ranged from angry to pitying to coldly satisfied. "I helped a woman give birth," Thomas said simply. "That's what I did. I saw 3 people dying of thirst and I gave them water. I saw a child being born and I didn't let her come into this world alone in the dark. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. But I won't apologize for it. I won't say I was wrong, because I wasn't." Judge Blackwood banged his gavel. "You aided the enemy in a time of declared hostilities. You drew a weapon on a citizen of this territory. The law is clear. I sentence you to 10 years hard labor at the territorial prison in Yuma. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to spare." 10 years. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Yuma prison was a death sentence disguised as incarceration. Men went in and came out broken, if they came out at all. The desert heat, the brutal work, the diseases that swept through the cells like wildfire, it all added up to a slow death that the territory could point to as justice served. But before the marshal could take Thomas away, something unexpected happened. The door to the courtroom opened, and a woman walked in. Her name was Margaret Ashford, widow of a cavalry officer killed in an Apache raid 5 years earlier. She had every reason to hate the Apache, every justification for wanting Thomas punished to the full extent of the law. Instead, she walked to the front of the courtroom and faced Judge Blackwood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to speak on behalf of the defendant." The judge frowned. "Mrs. Ashford, this trial is concluded. The sentence has been passed." "Then let me speak to the sentence," she replied. "Thomas Caldwell helped deliver a baby. My husband died fighting Apache warriors, men with rifles and skill and the will to fight. He didn't die fighting pregnant women and children. If we've come to the point where we're punishing men for showing mercy to women giving birth, then we've lost something more important than this territory. We've lost our humanity." A murmur ran through the courtroom, Judge Blackwood banged his gavel for order. Are you suggesting we should let Apache roam free on settled land? That we should ignore the threat they pose? I'm suggesting that there's a difference between warriors and women with babies, Margaret said. And if we can't see that difference, if we punish the men who can, then we're no better than the savages we claim to be fighting. The judge's face reddened. The sentence stands, Mrs. Ashford. Take the prisoner to Yuma. But Margaret's words had done something. They'd created a crack in the certainty, a moment of doubt. As the marshal led Thomas away in chains, he saw it in the faces watching him. Not everyone believed he was wrong. Not everyone thought what he'd done deserved 10 years in hell. The journey to Yuma took 2 weeks, Thomas chained in the back of a wagon that jolted over every rock and rut in the road. He had time to think, to wonder if he'd made a mistake, if he should have let the Greaves party take the Apache women and saved himself this fate. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Chodini's face as she held her newborn daughter, saw the love and fierce protection in her expression, and he knew he'd do it again. He'd do it 100 times over, even knowing the price. Yuma Prison squatted on a bluff overlooking the Colorado River, a collection of adobe cells and stone walls that radiated heat like a furnace. Thomas was processed, stripped of his identity, given a number, 2847. He was assigned to the quarry detail, breaking rocks under the merciless Arizona sun for 12 hours a day, every day, with Sundays off for the prisoners to contemplate their sins and pray for redemption. The work broke men. Thomas watched it happen, saw strong men wither and collapse, saw the light go out of eyes that had once held hope. He survived by retreating into himself, by holding on to the memory of that night by the fire, of the newborn baby's first cry, of the moment when he'd chosen mercy over fear. It became his talisman, the thing that kept him human when everything around him conspired to reduce him to an animal. Months passed, then a year. Thomas learned to endure the heat, the exhaustion, the casual violence of guards who saw prisoners as less than human. He learned to keep his head down, to do his work, to survive one day at a time. Letters came occasionally from Prescott, from Margaret Ashford, who wrote to tell him that she hadn't forgotten him, that she was working to get his sentence reduced. But the territorial government had no interest in mercy for an Apache lover. Then, in the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years into his sentence, something changed. A new guard arrived at Yuma, a man named Joseph Whitehorse. He was Apache himself, one of the scouts who worked for the army, hunting his own people in exchange for safety and a salary. He saw Thomas's name on the roster and the crime he'd been convicted of, and something passed across his face, some recognition or memory. That night, Whitehorse came to Thomas's cell. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "I know what you did. Chodini is my cousin. The baby you helped deliver, she's alive. They're both alive, living with what's left of our band in the White Mountains." Nalin told everyone the story of the white man who chose their lives over his own freedom. "You're known among our people. You're honored." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, some dam he'd built to hold back hope. They made it. They're alive. Whitehorse nodded. They made it. And Nalin said to tell you, if I ever found you, that your kindness created a debt that can never be repaid. But she wanted you to know it won't be forgotten. Not by her. Not by any of us. It was such a small thing, this message from a people he'd helped once on a single night. But it meant everything. It meant his suffering had purpose. It meant that somewhere, a little girl was growing up who wouldn't have existed if he'd ridden past that night, if he'd chosen fear over compassion. Thomas served 5 more years in Yuma before Margaret Ashford's campaign finally succeeded in getting him released early for good behavior. He walked out of those gates in 1885, a free man, but changed in ways that went deeper than the scars on his back from the lash or the permanent squint from years in brutal sun. He was 40 years old and looked 60, his body broken by hard labor, his spirit tempered by the knowledge that the world punishes mercy more surely than it punishes cruelty. He didn't go back to Prescott. That life was gone, burned away in the fire of one choice on one night. Instead, he headed north, to the White Mountains, to the Apache reservation, where the government had confined the remnants of bands that had once roamed free across the territory. He didn't know what he'd find there, didn't know if Chodini and her daughter were even still alive after 7 years. But when he rode into the reservation settlement, an older Apache woman saw him and stopped, recognition dawning across her weathered face. Narlin. She was grayer now, more bent by time and hardship, but her eyes were the same, sharp and knowing. She called out in Apache, and people came from the scattered wiki-ups, drawn by the excitement in her voice. And then Chodini emerged, a woman in her late 20s now, strong and healthy, with a daughter beside her. The girl was 7 years old, tall for her age, with her mother's eyes and a serious expression that made her seem older than her years. Her name, Thomas learned, was Dahana, which meant she is the only one, chosen because she'd been born in the presence of a miracle, a white man who'd risked everything so she could live. Chodini approached Thomas slowly, studying his face, seeing the toll the years had taken. She spoke in halting English, words she'd learned from the reservation teachers. "You came back," she said, wonder in her voice. "After everything they did to you, you came back." Thomas looked at the little girl, at Dahana, who watched him with open curiosity. "I wanted to see if it was worth it," he said, "if what I did mattered." Chodini placed her hand over his heart, the same gesture Narlin had made 7 years earlier. "It mattered," she said. "You gave my daughter life. You gave me life. In our way, that makes you family. Always." Thomas stayed on the reservation. He found work as a translator, using his knowledge of Apache to help mediate between the people and the government agents who controlled every aspect of their lives. He watched Dahana grow up, helped teach her to read and write English while she taught him more of her own language. He became part of the community in a way he'd never been part of Prescott, accepted not despite what he'd done, but because of it. Years later, when Dahana was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how she came into the world, about the sunset, the fire, the white man who'd chosen mercy when the world demanded cruelty. She would tell them that their great-grandmother Narlin used to say that one act of kindness could change the world, could ripple out in ways that couldn't be measured or predicted. And she would tell them about Thomas Caldwell, who'd lived to be 73 years old, who'd spent the last 28 years of his life on the Apache reservation, who'd been buried according to Apache custom when he died, his grave marked with stones and prayer feathers. She would tell them that he'd once said the 7 years he spent in Yuma were worth it, every brutal day, every moment of suffering, because they'd bought something precious, the knowledge that he'd been more than what the world told him he had to be. Thomas Caldwell never became rich or famous. His name didn't go down in history books. Most people who knew of him at all remembered him as the Apache lover, the traitor who'd chosen the wrong side. But on a reservation in the White Mountains of Arizona, his story lived on, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that in a time and place defined by violence and hatred, one man had looked at 3 desperate people and seen not enemies, but human beings worthy of help. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Dahana would think about that sunset in 1878, the night she was born, and she would whisper a prayer of thanks for the cowboy who'd given her mother water, who'd built a fire in the darkness, who'd stood against his own people so she could live. She would think about the price he'd paid and the life he'd chosen afterward, and she would understand something fundamental about courage, that it's not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, knowing the cost and choosing love anyway. The frontier had demanded Thomas Caldwell choose between his people and his conscience. He'd chosen conscience, and it had cost him everything the world said mattered. But it had given him something the world couldn't measure, The knowledge that when it counted most, when one sunset offered him a chance to be more than what fear and hatred demanded, he'd taken it. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered. Not the judgment of Prescott, or the sentence of Judge Blackwood, or the years in Yuma. Just that moment by the fire, when a baby took her first breath, and a man made the choice that would define the rest of his life. That was the story Dahana told her children. That was the story they told theirs. And somewhere in the telling and retelling, Thomas Caldwell became more than a man. He became a reminder of what's possible when we choose to see each other's humanity, even when everything around us says we shouldn't. The frontier shocked by what happened after he helped the Apaches at sunset was a frontier that had forgotten what it meant to be human. Thomas Caldwell remembered. And for that, he paid the price and earned the reward, and lived long enough to know that both were worth it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make when the world demands we choose sides, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments. Would you have made the same choice Thomas did, knowing what it would cost? Your engagement helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. Stories of courage and conscience that challenge everything we thought we knew about the Old West. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter in our exploration of the real human stories behind the frontier legends.